Graduation rate's under 30%. So I myself had to figure out how to hack education, or it was all over.
How do you even know Stanford's an option, Yale's an option?
I'm now having to tell, because thanks to the Supreme Court, tools have now started adding diversity and inclusion questions on, and then these kids have no idea what that language is. So I'm pulling things from my PhD files and from my debate files to try to get high schoolers into college, because it's that competitive.
You're saying the industry is getting more transparent.
There's opportunities for AI coaches, which I started seeing when I was at PIMCO working in wealth management side. There's opportunities to use to optimize.
Mr. Beast is? So one of his documents got leaked where he has this section that says consultants are cheat code. Hey guys, welcome back to Fund and Founders. Today we have on Anthony. Anthony, why don't you tell listeners what you're working on, where they can reach out, and I have this joke that retention is 5 minutes, so I like plugging everyone now, and then we'll go from there.
And I like trying to be concise.
Yeah.
So I'm Anthony Berryhill. So I own a company called Elite College Hacker. What we do, or rather what I do right now, I work with folks from either preparing to undergrad to trying to get a PhD or an MBA or a JD. So I've worked with people, all different populations. Often the hardest populations, so international students, Asian American students have been a huge, 60% of who I work with, a lot of women in STEM. And that's kind of the business as a whole. In terms of myself, I'm very much former at-risk youth from lower Ninth Ward, New Orleans, so the part of New Orleans that got wiped out by Katrina. Place that had graduation rates under 30%. So I myself had to figure out how to hack education, or it was all over.
Yeah,
and a lot of the things I taught myself across the various experiences, I'm sure I'll bring up in our questions, are things that I've reverse engineered for people I work with. In terms of how I got the company started, it frankly came from one of my first students. I used to be a debate coach in high school when I was in college. How I got myself through college. And I visited him. He makes a lot of money as a surgeon. He got me on, I drink a lot of wine with him, and he said, I need you to create this company. Students need you. So I guess.
Nice.
So it is, I'm sure we'll get into more details about my background and such, but that's the company. That's what I do. And that's how I got started.
Nice. And what's the best way for folks to reach out? Where should they reach out if they want to reach out to you?
The best way is through my email. So it's anthony@elitecollegehacker.com.
And we'll link everything, yeah.
Yes. And if anyone wants to have a 10, 15-minute conversation about where they are, if they're kind of serious about potentially getting a guide or a coach, or just trying to explore it, that's the best way to get in touch with me. I'm also on LinkedIn as well.
Okay, sweet. And we'll link everything, and just wanted to get that out of the way, plug everyone, and then we'll go from there.
Sound good.
I like kicking things off by asking, where do you think your entrepreneurial journey started? You mentioned you were a debate coach. How did you even get into this space, and what would you say was your first instance of entrepreneurship?
I have an unusual answer for that. Frankly, I think it was elementary school.
Okay.
So this is a little controversial, but when I was a young kid, I was very much in the inner city in the kind of schools that frankly give the term school to prison pipeline its definition.
Okay.
So we're talking places we're talking Hollywood levels of abuse, violence to all black students. So it was actually when I was 5 when I realized I'm in this school that's not safe. I know what the path looks like if I kind of just do the footballs, music, whatever. That path doesn't go anywhere. So I had to start thinking in an entrepreneurial way, how do I get out? How do I figure out the system? And then that kind of just ... when I went, eventually a program called Breakthrough Collaborative found me and frankly saved me.
Okay.
And they moved me to a high school where, it's Darden Newman School. I loved them to death. But no one, and this is the beginning of the business idea, no one really sat down and say, here's how you read a book properly. Here's how you study these questions. So when I was taking my first, tests in 7th grade, I thought, this is like reading Klingon. The words did not make any sense. I'm like, I don't know what's happening here. And that's kind of where the light bulb started hitting. It's like, there is a huge gap in education. Not just a gap, billions of gaps, where people are kind of being put in these experiences, but no one onboards them. No one tells them what to do. So that's kind of where it started. I had to realize that if I just do things the normal, traditional way, there's no opportunity. I don't have the resources, the wealth, the family connections, etc. So I had to start thinking, I had to start hacking, so to speak, as I call myself. Now, in terms of the business itself, what I didn't say about my background was I was in academia for about 10 years.
Got it.
Stanford undergrad, 7 years of a Yale PhD. One of my debate students said, hey, you're going to be poor. We don't want you to be poor again. You're weird. Austin's weird. And I know a company to refer you to. So then I worked at an expert network firm for about 7 years. And then that's when I realized I have to, this is not going to work. So that's when so this was very much a side hobby.
Yeah.
Be it coaching debate or, frankly, I did about 10 years I was volunteering, coaching students. And then I realized, well, if I have to make money, there's kind of like an action, semi-desperation. It's like, I got to get something done. So the idea was, let me just take anyone who asks. And then that became and then eventually word of mouth has grown to a point where I can feed myself every year.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
So taking a quick step back, right? You mentioned you were in New Orleans. Your school system wasn't the best.
Yeah.
How do you even know Stanford's an option, Yale's an option? And the reason I ask is, so I did my undergrad in India. I did my grad school here in the U.S. For someone who's not born and raised in the system, it's really hard to understand options versus I feel like people keep referencing state colleges and all these programs and, you follow football and you're aware of a lot of opportunities. But for example, from my point of view, I didn't even know what my options are. My sister was here, so I had a little bit more insight into you can apply here, do this, do that, whatever. But the generic route is give the GRE, apply to 20 programs, computer science or electrical or the standard, there's those standard options that every Indian is told.
And go through the U.S. News and World Report rankings that are
and if it's not top 20, it's not good enough for an Indian parent. But so with that context, what's the unlock for you to be like, hey, I'm going to go to Stanford. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to Yale. Here's what I'm going to do. Let's talk about that early journey a little bit.
Yeah. For me, it's a lot of serendipity and a lot of being opportunist. So I mentioned debate a bit because anyone sees me, I am not a football player or a basketball player. My sport was debate because I think, so a lot of the story comes down to when opportunities present themselves, even if they don't look like the way you want them, at least investigate. That's been the answer. So my high school, speech and debate was a mandatory class at the time. You will not graduate until you, the speech teacher, I'm like, we're not going to get along. The debate guy, I have no idea who he is. Let me just figure it out. And that's kind of where the bug hit. Doing debates in classes, the debate coach grabbed me. He tried to convince me to join the team 8 times. The 9th time, he was persistent. I'm like, I'm going to go to a tournament. And then that kind of started a whole path. So I learned that going through debate and traveling across the country, I got exposed to things that, frankly, my entire family never got exposed to.
Got it.
So there's a Stanford debate tournament. Well, duh. Or a camp. I got to go to those campuses and see and learn things that I would never. Frank, let me be blunt. No one in my neighborhood knew about any of this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's one. The second is I've learned about these things just being super curious, intellectually curious, which I'm sure if I talk about insights, I think a lot of people think about, okay, let me just do things the way I'm familiar. And they're not asking those questions like, I hear about those Ivy League schools, but what are they really like?
Yeah.
And people don't do things like just YouTubing day in the life videos.
Yeah.
It's amazing if you go down those rabbit holes, you start finding out. So
Makes
in terms
sense.
of my life and things that happened with me, it's making a lot of friends, going to a lot of events, being the only black guy in the room, to be completely blunt, right? And by constantly putting myself in that room, I'm able to find out things that I can then share with other people and then also leverage myself. So there's billions of examples I can give of that, but I think there's a risk, there's a kind of a, and this is very entrepreneurial, right? It's you don't know what that opportunity looks like.
Yeah,
you don't know if that person in the corner, could set you up with your business. So I've always had the bias toward, people have seen me that way, so I see other people that way, and that's how you find out opportunities, and that's how you start this journey.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And so, what was the unlock, right? So you got into Stanford. Quickly talk about how many places did you apply to?
Yeah.
Is there some unlock that helped you get into the top school?
A little bit of context, this was around 1999. So we did not have Google. We had Metacrawler and dial-up network. So it was tougher.
If you had dial-up.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Thankfully, I did. But so the unlock for me for me, when I looked at my file, right, super anti-stereotypical black guy from this neighborhood where people celebrate if you graduate high school.
Yeah.
Right? So what I had to do is figure out, all right, one unlock is just pure honesty. I think we call it authenticity now. It's like, I can't BS, right? If I write an essay, it's like, I love math and science, they're not going to believe that crap.
Yeah.
They're going to look at my address, look at the letters and say, this person's BSing us. Gone. So when I wrote my essay, it was simply just like, this is really violent. I don't belong anywhere. That was actually the thesis. And this is my life, and this is what I'm trying to get out. That's it. What I didn't know was how much that kind of honesty would resonate. It got to a point where people were calling my college counselor and being like, is this real? In one case, he said, yeah, the admissions officer told me the entire committee cried reading your essay. And I'm like, I know this is, I did not believe it. So that's one unlock. It's like, and I tell this to every client, it's don't say things people want to hear. Don't lie. Don't try to BS the committee. Because people, and I think you know this too in entrepreneurship and business, people don't like when someone trying to treat them like a sucker. So that's unlock number one. Unlock number two is seeing the beauty in things that are not socially popular. So if you were to go down my list of activities, I was on the computer programming team. I was a competitive programmer. Did debate. Did a lot of writing. Writing contests. None of those things were very popular. And my parents hated every one of them. They're like, why can't you just do football? And I'm like, I'm a nerd. I'm sorry. What do you want from me? But in doing those things as much as I wanted to do them, then that starts unlocking other things. So a good example of this. By doing debate, it made me a better writer. And when I started noticing my grades, I was a B student in English. And I certainly turned into an A student when I started qualifying to tournaments, and my debate coach would announce those awards at assembly. Nice. And it's also and I started thinking, wait a minute, there's a psychological game here to admissions and persuasion that we talk about in business, and part of my company is trying to teach people those same skills in admissions. So I could go on and on, but those are two biggies. Right?
Nice.
It's pursue things you don't think matter. I'll give you one fun example. I've had students with 2.9s and don't even talk about the SATs. And the parents are like, just get them into a college, please.
Any college.
Yeah, they're like, we don't know, our kids screwed up. And I call these rescue cases. And in one case in particular, I'll hide the information. The student, after I cross-examined him stuff, 3 hours, like, what did you spend your last 4 hours doing, years doing? Look at your transcript, like, what did you do? And he's like, well, I'm a near professional level Fortnite player. I'm like, where's your evidence of that? And he showed me, and I'm like, why didn't you say that 3 hours ago? His answer, well, everyone tells me video games are immature. And I'm just like, that's how people lose in admissions. Because they don't know that there are esports priorities. There's other things that are tied to video game excellence. So I guess that could be not a second, but the third point, which is going beyond your own stereotypes and assumptions. Yeah. Because I've learned, talking to CEOs, having to, I was at the expert network firm, having to convince private equity guys, like, they don't buy the biases that average people have. And certainly, the top schools don't either.
Nice. I like that. Mm-hmm. So you go to Stanford, you go to Yale. Mm-hmm. Was there something that changed in your sort of thought process and approach to just doing all these? Mm-hmm. Because you had an idea, you got in, mm-hmm. You knew what the application process was. Yeah. After being in these institutions for roughly, 10 years with your PhD and everything, did something change with the process? Did something change with your understanding of what it means to be in an Ivy League, what it means to go to top schools?
I guess I'll separate that out by process and my understanding.
Yeah.
So table the process for a moment. My understanding, what I realized is people, when I was growing up, everyone said just go to an Ivy League. It's like these romanticized notions, sell your passion, sell your dreams, all this other stuff. But what I noticed is that no one talked about the hard work it takes to even get there.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I had $100 and a blue suitcase and a plane ticket. Like, the top schools didn't know about low-income,
neighborhoods.
Thank you. Yeah. They just didn't talk about it. They didn't care about it. The financial aid office and I yelled at each other plenty. Now they do, right? So there's a logistics and how to get it done, how to survive versus just the romantic notions. That's one part. The other part is I don't think people know what they're asking for when they're looking for college. So when I was at Stanford, you take an econ class back in the day, it's one chapter per day, 5 days a week. And your first test is in 2 weeks of the term. It's kind of like the intellectual Marines. And that's one thing that I really kind of got in my spirit is like, how do I write this 40-page paper? Or how do I translate these weird equations that I would never see at the equivalent school in a normal university? So I think the biggest thing is recognizing how hard it is and how often even people who go to like the 4.0s of the boarding school, they get their butts kicked because they don't know that they have to hack those schools either.
Yeah.
You have to know to go to office hours. You have to actually read the syllabus. You have to know how to smooth a professor professional. You have to actually there's like higher levels of thinking that they demand on those tests and those papers. And that's one place I would say really screws people. is that they think that everyone thinks I'm awesome and everyone tells me I'm going to Harvard, that it's going to be okay. But when they run into a computer science class or a math class where it's a readout, they fry. So sometimes I'm working with undergrads who are in that position where they're like, I was pre-med, I had no business, had no business there, and I want to go to law school, but I have a bunch of F's in my transcript. And I'm like, So that's one thing. It's like people aren't very they're not very knowledgeable about what they're signing up for at the university level, and they're not very pragmatic about those decisions. And in my case, what I learned is I couldn't afford to kind of be delusional. It's like either I pass or I'm homeless, right? I don't have a place to stay. So that actually taught me a lot about like the rigor that's required. And then I started reverse engineering that. Like, so sometimes my job is not simply to get you in, it's I need to increase your skills in reading, writing, analysis, listening, because you won't survive the interview. But even if you did survive the interview, you would fail out in semester.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I like that. So you get out of Yale, you work in the expert network space. So you mentioned that once you had the unlock, you're trying to help other kids with this unlock and try to do that, right? Yeah. So what was your first instance of, consulting with someone on this topic per se versus like when did it go from, oh, hey, I'm just going to help people who reach out to me versus let me start thinking about this as a business? It was at the end of my time with the Expert Network. So this was my story is also a story of side hobby turns into full-time thing. Because I was always teaching debate and coaching and doing other stuff. And those folks started asking me, that's how it got started. They asked me to do the admissions work because they were like, what you taught me about how to beat students from, fancy Northeast or Northern California schools and win Stanford, you can help me get into Stanford. So I didn't believe that. So it took about 10 years of like, I don't have a methodology for this. The language I use is frankly is not the language of admissions officers. It's a language of more like military people, like language like I tell people to embrace the suck. To more like, oh, you want to apply to all the Ivies? It's going to suck. What's his name? The guy who wrote the book, Expert Ownership? No, Willick. Yeah, okay. Yeah. He says that thing. That kind of language, attention to detail. When I look at an essay and I'm like, reread the prompt. You missed that word. Just kind of like the same thing in debate, where it's like you miss a word or you misinterpret something, you lose a championship. Yeah. So I started seeing those connections, and I hit a certain number of people, like 5, 7, and how much work that is. I thought, I can't do this for free. I can't volunteer. And I think the thing that really forced it into being a business was actually when I left that first company. Got it. Because I didn't know where I was going. And frankly, I've done HR, I've done learning and development. My profile is not the profile to get 100, job interviews. So it was another one of those moments like either I do it right now or we don't pay rent. So I started having to figure out things like reverse engineer everything else, like pricing and like client management, those things. Makes sense. So you start the business. Mm-hmm. Are clients coming in day one? Mm-hmm. Like, how did you understand? How did you know? Okay, I need to start an LLC, start a company. Talk through that first initial. Yeah, the LLC part I haven't done for various business reasons. Well, I did a lot of Googling, as I always do. Okay. Right. Two things. So there's the human intelligence part. So people who were trying to push me, I'm like, hey, all right, so what should I do? And look at my pricing, and they're like, you're crazy. Charge 10 times more. Or a friend would tell me go on social media. I'm like, so a lot of that part, but also a lot of, frankly, I think about it as like a project, like project management itself. Yeah. Where it's, if I were to try to do this more consistently, let me track my lessons learned, like they say in Agile. Let me track the ways I screwed up, and then each year. So I almost treated myself as like an MVP. It's like I have these students, I have these results, I'm tracking them. This isn't, and then do that year 2, and then year 3, and then now at year whatever it is, right? Now I have a sense of I know all the ways this can bomb. And now I can scale. So it's very much, that book, Lean Startup, that kind of methodology is, this is a pilot, let's see if this works, because here's the thing, I had no idea whether or not a non-admissions officer from my background would ever be seen as credible. There was no evidence of that. I didn't even have it as a hypothesis. And I didn't know it would be successful either, because the scary thing about my business is that the results have nothing to do with me often. It's a bunch of 12 people in a room fighting it out. Think the election's arbitrary. Try group psychology and admissions. So I had to figure all of that out to get the confidence and the data
And then once I started doing that, then I start reaching out to podcasts or other people who want to ask me questions. So that's probably my best answer. It's treating myself as a lean startup.
Nice.
And then iterate and then iterate and then iterate to the point where I'm like, okay, I know that if I have 50 more clients, I know what this process looks like. I was not there last year. So it took a long time to see all of those pitfalls that, frankly, no one warns you about.
Yeah, 100%.
In additions even. Yeah.
Also, the other thing with this sort of industry and businesses, my understanding is it's very seasonal, where you have a main admission for the fall time.
Yeah.
Then people do spring as well, but probably not at the same volume as fall, right? So how do you think about seasonality when running the business?
It hurts. It really hurt last summer, and I didn't have much cash at all. The way I think about it is it forces me to be more creative.
Okay.
But even after this year, I started thinking, well, I get all these students there's some cases where it's a sad conversation, where it's like, I just had to tell a student, hey, even I can't get you into an IB. The grades are too low, the skill level isn't there. So what I realized, I think about so we have two problems, right?
Yeah.
Income problem, education problem. So I've started creating like a coaching model. Okay, let's catch you years before. The one student I'm thinking about was like, I wish I grabbed them in 9th grade to say, hey, COVID is not an excuse. If you bomb this year, like there's so many kids who they were done after that COVID year, not because of COVID, because they thought they could put their foot off the wheel. So what did that do with seasonality? Well, it forced me to create more services.
Nice.
So now, it's not just not just people in high school who need to prepare in advance. People who are in undergrad who don't want to bomb their stuff, or in grad school who are setting themselves up for those things. So seasonality has forced me to think of year-long models. And what I'm working on now, using my experience in learning development, is creating e-learning courses. So I'm thinking about how do I have revenue ongoing, and that's where I am right now.
Nice. I like that. And so a couple of things I wanted to ask you about. So you're running this business. You talked about sort of client acquisition. How do you do retention offers, right?
Yeah.
You want to reduce your churn. You're increasing the lifetime value for customer by not just being like, hey, I'll help you in admissions, before, after, and sort of you're expanding on that. Service base, which also expands your customer time frame, so that it's nice to think about sort of the business growing from that perspective, right?
I'll add in too.
Yeah.
The way this took 10 years, but the way I started thinking about this is, I think about it the way I thought about like being a teacher or a learning development corporate person. It's like in the workplace, you get an employee. There's a whole recruiting cycle prior to that, right? And then you have to onboard people, and then you have to train them in the next job, and then the next step, and then the next step. What hasn't happened in education, I'm shocked. I've been to so many conferences. No one thinks about students in that as if they have a timeline of development. And God forbid, like people from my background or people who are marginalized who really need that kind of assistance. So there's a gap. There's a huge gap, right, in both worlds, because most people just say, oh, you're the best, throw you in there. And we always assume it's only, the African-American kids who need help. No, everybody needs help. They're all struggling. They're all crying and screaming, and they're like, I don't know how to do my job. We've seen that a lot here. And the same thing's happening in schools. So, and what I didn't know, because I designed my work around my own experience being hyper marginalized and having no resources, and really, frankly, not being able to afford virtue signaling and that kind of stuff. What I didn't know was that the students who I assumed were the most elite, they also need that more, or if not more badly, because they're also being underserved often. And then, as a student at Stanford, unfortunately got to see some of those cases where, I'm not going to name names, but there are certain schools where you would think people would just walk in, but those kids would fail out. So I'm thinking, what is happening? And I think the answer is thinking about this and I think this is how you see the business. I'm developing piece by piece of this piece about develop the undergrad, develop these grad programs, and then my next step right now is trying to have, in a perfect world, a model where I can capture people for 10, 15 years, as opposed to just the 2-3 month period for admissions.
Nice. I like that. And one thing I wanted to add on top of that is, so as you're thinking about this industry, and this is not some data I looked up, but just a general vibe I get from social media and everything, is there's a trend for people saying, you don't need to go to college. You can build your business. And so as an industry, is this industry growing? Is it stagnant? How is this college admissions industry, and how are colleges in general changing with the change in social media, change in sort of general consumer behavior. I think I don't think I phrased it very well.
No, I get it. Yeah. There's a couple of answers. The first is, how do I put this? In terms of the industry, it's definitely growing, and unfortunately, as we're seeing in other spaces, like there's mostly snake oil salespeople. It's, I could give you story after story of the things that my students will tell me that I will literally be in a meeting listening with other counselors to school talking. And then a student will say, hey, Anthony, I'm so freaked out. And they'll give me this advice where I'm saying, if you do that in your essay, it is an immediate rejection. Who told you that? And it's like, oh, I went to this TikTok and this person talking about their passion projects. And I won't name the big companies, but there's a lot of nonsense going on. So as with any industry, like in social media, there's like billions of people. Here's the thing, though. People are really attracted to just authentic stuff that actually works, and they can tell. So what's happening right now with my business is 30% of my work is rescue coaching, where someone will hire a company, and let's just say the kind of company you see on New York Times, and they'll drop $80K. I'm trying to be nondescript because it's actually more than one company. There's like 10. I can name 10 right off the top of my head. And then the parents are like, I only talk to this kid every 30 minutes a week, or I'm just getting a bunch of platitudes as my advice. Like, why are they telling my child to talk about wishes and dreams and, being determined? Like, and the parents are not dumb if they're paying that kind of money, and then they'll come to me and I'm starting to realize, oh, okay. So this industry it's getting more public. There's a lot of money in it, which means you're going to have a lot of scammers and people who just...
And when we say industry, we're talking about just college admissions.
Yeah, I'm just talking college admissions at the undergrad level.
You're saying there are people paying $80K.
Oh, if not more.
For one admission cycle, or just the admission of...
One admission cycle.
Okay.
I mean, I don't charge anywhere in that dimension. And, there are philosophical reasons for that. But, there are people starting... I don't talk to anyone until they're in 9th grade.
Okay.
There are programs that are well-known that are starting at 6th grade. And we're just talking the United States. You're not talking China or any other country abroad. So there's a lot of people running in for those kind of opportunities. The upside is twofold. One, if you're really good and you're authentic, people can tell. And the fact that I'm word of mouth and haven't done any social media yet, that's changing, kind of speaks to that. And two, what I've noticed, and I guess this answers the other part of the question, colleges have gotten much more nuanced.
Okay.
So it used to be in the 1980s, be student body president, get a 1600 in SAT, get a 3.9, have a certain background, you're in.
Like there was a couple set paths that, like if you follow this, your chances are high.
Yeah. And I will and I'm focusing only on undergrad. Grad and professional are probably a different conversation. Not probably. They're similar but related. The schools realize they're becoming more corporate, and they're realizing we need the best kind of person everywhere. And that's not going to always look like the 4.0 student who wants to do computer science, and often isn't. Not to mention there's just obvious mathematical issues, right? So I coached a lot in Northern California for debate and admissions. And let's be completely honest, I coached for schools where every student could get into Stanford based on academic ability. And they're all saying the same crap. They're all doing, I don't want to be stereotypical, but I'm literally telling you about files of kids who would do student body president, key club, tennis, piano, debate. And I'm looking at these kids sometimes and telling them, you are all doing the same thing. It's similar to debaters where I'll tell them, you all want to argue the same things and you think you're going to win a tournament?
Yeah.
Against teams and squads that have 15 coaches who want you to do that? So it's it's funny that, the judges, the colleges, so to speak, are much more, they just can't, colleges are not in a position where you can just take every kid who on paper looks like they follow the right path. So now schools have started getting tougher. The essay questions are much harder. To give you, make it concrete, when I was doing my PhD at Yale, I had a question about leadership without authority because I was doing a lot about political theory and leadership. And now high schoolers are getting asked that question. Diversity and inclusion. One of my PhD exams was in racial, identity politics. I'm now having to tell, because thanks to the Supreme Court, schools have now started adding diversity and inclusion questions on, and then these kids have no idea what that language is.
Yeah. So
I'm pulling things from my PhD files and from my debate files to try to get high schoolers into college because it's that competitive.
Makes sense. So you're saying the industry is getting more transparent. There's more information as well as misinformation going out there, right? Yeah. So what's the 80-20, right? So you know who Mr. Beast is? Mm-hmm. So one of his documents got leaked where he has this section that says consultants are cheat codes, where he's like, if you want to do X, go find someone who did X, talk to them, and then you figure out how to beat whatever they do. Like the example he gave in the doc is make the world's largest pizza. Go find the person who has the current record. They'll tell you what challenges they face, and then you. And so, like, to that point, what's the 80-20 of like working with a college admissions counselor? Like, how do you vet them?
Yeah.
What are some price ranges that make sense versus what's very up there? You said 80K. I think 80K is a lot, but again, depends on who you are. Just quickly walk through sort of that 80-20 of how should someone go about this? Let's say they don't have the cash, they don't have the time to work with a counselor. What do you recommend they do? Like, how should they approach this? And then if they do, how do you find someone, vet someone? And
I'll do it the second part first.
Yeah.
Let's say, I'll just give you the model I used. The 80-20 here would be, number one, don't screw up your grades. Like, and that means there's a line in that. It's actually make smart, and this is actually probably the most important for any student, make smart, well-informed decisions, not emotional ones. So if one thing I give myself credit for is that perhaps because of a lot of imposter syndrome, I know where I suck. So I knew not to take AP US history. I knew that was an F waiting to happen. I knew not to take AP art history because I talked to people and I realized I can't memorize very well. But most students don't do that. So they make bad decisions that then show up on their transcript, and then even if they have an accounts counselor, like, there's some tough conversation. So good judgment is one. The second thing is actually the Mr. Beast rule you just quoted. It's there's this discourse about passion projects, and I hate the word passion. I hate how people use it because it gives people the sense of it's about how emotional I am.
Yeah.
It's like, they'll say things like they'll frankly treat schools or their activities like hookup parties. It's like I just dump you whenever I don't feel like it. But that's not. You're in this game. No one wants to be treated that way.
Yeah.
So you actually have to be much more substantive and more disciplined rather than passionate. So for me, when I was a student, it was, you know what? I'm going to write all these papers that my creative writing teacher wants me to do, and I'll just submit this poem, whatever, and see if it gets in. And there was a situation where I actually did win a poetry contest. Just by doing that extra work, I didn't want to do it, wasn't passionate about writing that. So I think more discipline, less passion. So just execute on things as much as you can and ask people like what the gaps are. Some of the best projects I've helped students do were situations where there was a problem, often that pissed them off, and they and I we would talk about what the solution is, often creatively. One quick story. One of my best students ever, I coached her in debate. She got top 20 in the U.S. When I coached her. But she was also a superstar in the classroom, very much in one of those Northern California schools. And it was the year of COVID, and she's like, my grandmom is very, very, this is a risk, and these politicians are trying to force us into school. What do I do about it? And I'm like, you're in politics, right? Don't you have some friends that are just as pissed off as you? She's like, yeah. I'm like, you're an activist. Why don't you grab them together? Get some press. Go to the city council. And she's like, oh, I'll do that. Not only did she do that, it got news attention. ... Pretty easy application, and she got into Harvard and every single UC school. So what is that? How does that? It demonstrates these two ideas because she amazing in the classroom, but wasn't relying on just the checkbox activities. She's like, I have a problem. I'm going to create my own solution to it. It's very entrepreneurial, actually. Yeah. And then I'm going to just run with it. And I think what people don't understand is this passion project language is total garbage. It's do projects, learn project management. When you do more of that stuff, then that makes you very appealing, not just for colleges, but also for jobs.
Makes sense. Okay. Yeah. And so let's say someone's working with someone. How do you vet them? How do you find the right person? What's a good ballpark range of like, hey, it can cost anywhere from X to Y. Let's talk about that because I think, again, because there's so much misinformation for anyone listening, what's the 80-20 there of like, okay, at least do this, don't do this. Here's like your 2 cents on that. Yeah.
So if someone I'm going to pretend like if I hire my, a first employee or so. Yeah. The first, if I were talking to myself and the employee, I would say, first off, how do you vet people? I have very qualitative metrics of this. So first, I vet the student for, are they self-driven? And I don't mean in that I work all the time way, but I mean I am doing things because I want to do them and I can articulate that to you. Are they independent? Some of my best students are ones who piss off their parents all the time. or who refuse to, follow the lead or weren't that popular. So I need to see some kind of like independence of thought, willingness to kind of, be challenging to where their environments are, which is, shocker, consistent with Ivy League expectations. And those two things usually take people out. The third thing I look for, and this is the qualitative section, is how coachable are they? I have what I call a no BS coaching style. I will tell you exactly how it is. I won't be mad. No one feels upset. Students always tell me, "Oh, this is the first time I felt seen in months." But at the same time, I will say, like, you have to vet for people who are willing to hear honesty, because most people in this space in education don't want to hear it. They want to be told they're awesome, perfect, genuine. Yeah. And I learned over 10 years of pain what those clients are like, and they usually fail, and you usually will want to run away. So that's on the student side. But I also vet the parents.
Okay. And
no one talks about that part. What I vet for is two things I want to avoid, and I do say no. One, the parent is what they call tiger parenting or helicopter parenting. That is an automatic fail. Usually that ends up being a lot of stress. The student's freaked out. None of the work gets done. The parents are making it about themselves. And in almost every situation where I've kind of let that happen, that's like, I have a 4% fail rate. That's 90% of it. So I vet for that with the parent. And also, part of my vetting is how I communicate with the parents. So again, the no BS style is I will tell them, hey, you may not be looking at I may not let you see your student's essay. I need to know how you feel about that. And if someone's like, how dare you? So what I'm vetting for is that there's a kind of how do I say this? Kind of a do what it takes attitude that I need from people.
Nice.
Even if it hurts their ego. Because I often have students who have stories that I know a Stanford admissions office will take them for.
Yeah.
It's not positive about their family background or their life or their culture or any of this other stuff that parents don't want to talk about. So that's when if I have to tell the parent to leave the room and they're not willing to, then how can I have that kind of vulnerable conversation and do what it takes to get them through? And that's a big one. Because often, I work with students who are often very traumatized. They don't even know how to process their own voice. And sometimes that means the parent can't be on the Zoom call, or, I got to tell them, hey, this is not your conversation.
Yeah.
And I will say this, I am often contracted, part of my business, I'm also contracted out by certain major companies, one in particular in China. And one of the things is the universal complaint, parents get too involved. Universal complaint. One of my companies said to me, please go in public and tell people this is about your child, not about the parent. So that's a big one, right? If the parents want to get it's kind of like if you're the expert in business, and you're a consultant, and the person you're consulting is like, I don't like anything you said, and they have no business telling you that. It's the same thing in admissions.
Makes sense.
So if that happens, it's an automatic no. I know we could probably talk about the business side of it, right? Honestly, on the pricing question, so I think of this, I just got a PMP because I like studying and trying to increase my own employability. But one of the things about that degree taught me, that certification taught me, was I use a lot of project methodologies I just didn't know. So in terms of how do I answer a question about pricing, I figure out what the scope is. So I put on my computer programmer agile hat and say, what is, actually more like waterfall, but what is the scope? Exactly. And because one thing I learned the hard way, and this is a good business lesson, is don't agree to a scope of work until you've really thought through how many hours that is.
Yeah.
So one big mistake I used to make is I would charge, when I was volunteering for people, these people would want 25 schools, half of which are Ivies or Ivy Pluses. And then I found myself working 40 hours a week for almost no money. Right. So because I romanticize that in my own head. I'm thinking it's about helping you, not about how many hours I'm putting in and what the costs are. So how do you price it? The only thing I can say is two things. One, price it according to how much work you're doing. Also, don't underprice. This is a big mistake I made. Because what I noticed over years is I would start experimenting with pricing. It was always fair, but just because my numbers used to be like cartoonishly low. I started noticing that the people who were bomb, who were just the biggest pains in the butts, were the ones I charged the least. And the ones I charged the most were like, yes, sir, whatever you say, so nice and sweet, would invite me for dinner. They're like, if you come. But the people I charged nothing to and worked like a dog, like they didn't even want to talk to me after the end of the process. And that pattern has continued even right now.
Yeah, it's also like you have to see how much do they value
Yes. Yeah.
this offer, right? And so it comes down to, well, if it's just a task for them, they're probably looking for someone to just do it for them instead of like being involved in the process, right? So I think that makes sense.
Yeah, and I guess the way I could put it more concisely is there are people who want to treat you as a vendor, and there are people who want to treat you as a partner, right? And I learned this from being in client service and expert network firms, all this stuff. You don't want people who treat you as vendors, because then you're not even a human being anymore. And people actually try, in that world, people won't even pay you the little bit they offer you.
Yeah.
What I say up front, and this is part of my vetting process, I say this is a team. This is a partnership. Your child is, they're driving the bus, I'm the driving instructor, and your job is to provide the bus. And let us do it. And so when you have that more partner, the vendor level model is no one's going to pay you. The partner level model, and I think there's so many analogies, right? You can charge a higher price, and it's actually more fun, and I can pay my own bills. So I've learned not to do the imposter syndrome and be too afraid to say, I studied a lot of books on this, and I'm like, how do I ask for big money and not freak out? And I read books on sales that would teach you, ask the price and shut up. Don't assume like what this other person's doing. And those are some lessons I learned in terms of that side. So I wish I had a more concrete answer about a methodology or an algorithm for this. There really isn't one. The only one I have is just thinking about it as a project manager. It's like, what's the scope? How much is it going to cost me in terms of my effort? And also, one line I also compare it to other clients, right? So if someone wants $200 a month, I'm like, that's an hour of work, sir. That's not fair to my other clients. So I try to ensure there's also parity there to keep myself honest in terms of making sure that I'm being responsible in the long term.
Makes sense. So thinking about it from the other lens, right? So if there's any students listening who are thinking about this, or any entrepreneurs thinking about this for their kids or whatever, how should they accordingly vet and find someone to work with, right? So what's your your 2 cents on how should a parent or child think about this? What questions should they ask? What should they really know before working with a consultant for this?
Yeah, I would say personality is probably the most important, like whether or not that matches. There are people who are, for example, more bubbly. Like, I'm not bubbly. I'm not a cheerleader, right? I'm just I'll smile and make you feel good and take care of you, but no, I'm not that bubbly person. There are people who need that, right? So I'd say the first thing you have to figure out is, and this is similar to the admissions process, what do you need and want? My first question to someone is where do you think you need help? And those answers are all over the place. It could be, save me on this essay. It could be, I don't have a school list and it's 4 weeks to go. You don't know, right? So they need to figure that out before they kind of go to a counselor, because for 2 reasons. A, the counselor can't be that helpful. Otherwise, and B, you don't want to get screwed, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is I would Google the heck out of that person. See if they have resources online and like they talk through. Like, one way I know someone's a BSer versus really good at this is that if they will say things that are not popular but are accurate, that's huge.
Give me an example.
Yeah. If a student has a 3.2 and has C's in his transcript and there's nothing exceptional, there are folks who will say, with a bunch of passion and dreams and like all this kind of fluffiness, we can get the perfect essay to get you in. It's kind of analogous to like a military recruiter, right? Who's going to tell if they're selling you dreams and not kind of talking through the brass tacks of what you can and can't do, that is a red alarm.
Makes sense.
In other words, if it was a business based on volume and not like execution, and that's kind of, unfortunately, the larger scale ones tend to do this, then that should tell you that, that may not be the right fit. Yep. This is analogous to guidance counselors, by the way, because so many of them, to be fair to them, so many of them are overworked, so the advice they're giving is good at scale. Like, how do I convince 300 kids to do the right thing? Give them this generic advice versus I'm going to take 10 hours to kind of tell you how to hack this system and like carve out this project. Some counselors are good at that and want to do it. Many don't. So asking, so try to figure out how willing is a person to individualize what they're doing. If they're just throwing spreadsheets at you, that's different from, no, I really want to know what your scope is. I really want to know if you know what computer science is before you write an essay to Rice where they're going to test you on it. I think the last thing would be aware of how much marketing speak there is.
Okay.
So I've used this word passion a lot because it's It's one of those words where when I see it in an essay, I know we're in trouble. When I see it in marketing, I know there's something amiss going on, because there's the marketing of most people in the space is people are really scared, parents are freaked out, kids are freaked out. Let me use the trigger words to overwhelm your consciousness and get you to buy.
Yeah.
And I'm the opposite of that. I'm like, no, if you can get in, I will tell you how to get in.
It's like a startup using AI and everything now. It's like,
exactly.
I have AI this, AI that. It's like, even if you don't, but like to your point, it's a lingo versus
like specifics and execution. I've worked with students this cycle who should get in, and they've hired people who haven't even told them what an early application is. And I'm like freaking out. I'm just like, my imposter syndrome going straight to fire is like, how do you go from this school and hire this consultant and not know this? I should charge you more. Right. So I would say you would want a counselor who's willing to teach, because there's a lot to know. Like, this is a very complex system that we could talk for 3 hours about, because there's so many nuances. I'll give one free tip. I would say one big mistake people make is that they assume all these schools are similar, particularly the Ivy League. Says, I just want to get into an Ivy League, scares the living S out of me, because I'm like, you do know that Yale and Harvard do not have the same culture. You do not talk to them the same way. Stanford and Cornell are very different beasts, and they think themselves are different, but the essays that are written are like, I want to go to an Ivy League school like Stanford. And I just, that's not.
Yeah.
That's a quick way to, a lot of kids are rejected not because of affirmative action or this nonsense people say. They're rejected because they've been given bad advice that feels good, that has no basis in the complexities of how colleges think.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Quickly shifting gears
Sure.
to this whole industry as a whole, right? What are some insights you have from being in this space for the past 10, 20 years that someone who's not familiar would just not know about? Like, do you have some insights there? And then the other follow-up question to that is, with all this AI happening, people are trying to build businesses. I know of a couple different businesses trying to be built in this space. Where do you see opportunity for someone to build something?
I want to give a shout out to, in terms of the first question, insights. One organization that that I work with a lot is the National Speech and Debate Organization. They run the big debate nationals. One thing they've done that's brilliant, their marketing campaign is increasing student voice, particular word voice. One thing that will shock everyone is the student's voice is the most important. People think, when I talk about helicopter parenting, the problem is that their kid has no voice. So then the school is like, I don't want to take the parent. I want to know what the kid says, because the kid's the one who's on my campus and is on my dorm, who can embarrass me if they do something dumb. So what's happened, particularly the last 5 years, is getting more competitive, is that the more and more you can have your own stance. We say this in entrepreneurial world, like being contrarian, being right, being willing to piss people off and do the right thing, and having the ability to articulate it in your own language. That is a critical thing that almost no one talks about. But then you look at the results. It's pretty consistent across the board. Like, how did that kid with 3.8 get in and didn't do all these activities? Well, he was able to articulate a very interesting story that shows that he or she will say something interesting in a classroom that will make a professor happy, right? That's one thing. I think the second thing is knowing what you're asking for, and deeply. So maybe this is my bias as a former, I still coach, but as a debate coach, it's not about what I want the judge to vote for. It's what the audience wants, right? So when I was a debate coach, the way I would kind of grill it into the kids' heads is, I don't care if you think this is dumb. We know this judge, and that you're going for the national tournament. Like, do it. If I can give a short story, one of the first students who got 8th at nationals. When I was preparing her, we were writing a case, and she was very mad at the arguments I was telling her to argue, and it was like pro-military stuff. And from a very leftist background, and we were yelling at each other, and I don't yell. But I'm like, and I said to her, you're going to the national championship. Republicans have ballots too. So she finally did what I said, and then she had the case, and she said that I've won every ballot. And I'm like, well, think about your audience. So back to the point, I think what people miss is people start thinking, I want colleges to say my kid's great because of the activities that they did. Or let's say a fancy high school. We want to choose the best students who are going to get into your school. The school's priorities are inverted. So schools are thinking, we want the best classes of every background because we don't know where the next Oprah Winfrey is or the next Elon Musk is, depending on your opinion, or whatever. I've even had Trump supporters, like violently, pro-Trump, Trump. And my answer is, it's not my job to tell you who you are. It's my job to have you show what that is. And that student got in very quickly. So people start thinking it's about being left or woke or this or that. None of that matters, right?
Makes sense.
It's analogous to being in like high-level business, right?
Makes sense.
If you're at an investment bank and they know that you can make a lot of money, they'll look past all the identity stuff and just say, we aren't that person. And colleges are the same way. And I don't think people know, but the people who know that won't say it. And the people who don't know it, they're always wondering, like, why don't these kids get in? It's because they're on the wrong framework.
Makes sense. And then to where you see opportunity
In AI.
Not necessarily AI, but like if AI, great.
Yeah.
But like in this space, if someone wants to build for this space, what are some one or two things where you think there's opportunity to disrupt? Yeah. With AI, without AI, it doesn't.
Yeah, I'll leave the AI part on the table for a moment. I think at every part of this timeline I've been talking about, there's millions of opportunities.
Okay.
Because our education is not that great in terms of getting people at these higher levels of cognition. So I think if I were to name opportunities, I think one is you can look at certain subjects that are constantly taking students down. Like, I work so many women in STEM who are mistreated by teachers, not just, abroad, but here in the United States. So things that can make, those things easier. Like, how do I actually teach you how to do a derivative? How do I teach you the multiplication tables? And people have made millions of dollars on any one of those use cases. And by the way, those are the kind of projects I have my students doing, and I help them get in.
Yeah.
I have them do things across this timeline that they like. So you can pick any one of those topics: math, art, psychology, art history, doesn't matter. There is opportunity to have whole businesses because there's so many students who are struggling because of poor teaching, poor resources, bad methodologies, whatever. In terms of admissions proper, any part of this process can be automated, or you could use technology. I know folks who are places that are using AI to help process all the project management side of it, like the schools, making suggestions. There's opportunities for AI coaches, which I started seeing when I was at PIMCO working on the wealth management side. There's opportunities to optimize in terms of, how do I put this? Just education about this is a big one, how to do the basic skills of academics. Like speed reading, how do you write well? How do you write the personal statement? Like any one of those could be their own business because the resourcing is so bad in all of those things. So, for example, the personal statement, which everyone talks about, there really is, in my head, I'm not going to tell the formula here, but people have no idea what that looks like in terms of how, what it is an argument based on personal story that has a structure, but folks don't know what that structure is. So if I wanted to right now, I could probably create a course and then grab a developer and say, okay, here's a structure, ask these people these questions. These 3 hours I spend questioning people, get an AI agent to make the person process all of that. That alone could be a business. So any one of these components, be it on the content side or on the educational skills side or on the mission side, those are 3 different lanes where there are opportunities. And frankly, when I work with my students and we're creating projects, I'm identifying which of these lanes they care about, and I'm telling them to do projects on those things, which also has another benefit of making them look more intellectual.
Makes sense.
Then helps them get in.
Makes sense. No, I like that.
Mm-hmm.
I like that. And there's a bunch of companies I know who are trying to do small stuff. I think the only concern I have with building for this space is, one, it's a seasonal business.
Yeah.
So are you building a feature or a product would be one question. And the other thing is, how big from a monetary perspective are these niche ideas you're talking about?
Yes.
Versus I agree that there's need in these verticals you're talking about, but when you add in seasonality plus the audience you're selling to, your total LTV on a per customer basis gets lower.
Yep.
So then is one feature enough to build a big business? Or do you start with one feature, grow it out, build 10 or 15 features, and then it becomes a really profitable big business? So that would be the only concern I have with building in this space. And the other thing is, I know some folks who've tried building SaaS products for counselors to better manage their students? Because I think there's some statistic,
Naviance and all that other stuff.
because there's so many, there's some statistic where a college counselor spends 30 minutes with a kid per semester.
I believe it.
Which is not enough to help a kid, right?
Yeah.
Especially for a kid who doesn't know. Like, I got in, but like, okay, what are the good courses? How do I do this? How do whatever, right? And so I think the only concern I have with that kind of business is you're selling to schools. Selling to schools is very difficult.
Yes.
It's once a year process. And if the person you're selling to decides to leave, or they don't get the budget, or they get the budget but then they leave, and now the new dean's like, I don't care about this. That's a different kind of business. At that point, the SaaS software is not what's hard to make. It's the selling to schools.
Yep.
And do you want to be in that business of selling to schools? And so I think there's a couple like just caveats that
Big ones.
So that would be the only thing I wanted to say about that.
I would say the question is like, which problem do you want to have? My problem is a lead generation challenge. Lead generation, social media. It was a project management issue, right? Like figuring it out and like now it's lead generation and scaling. I think what you're speaking to, I guess what I would respond with is I think anyone who's thinking about this space should be very clear on their scope.
100%.
Because if you're...
And also, who do you want to build for?
Exactly.
Do you want to build for like folks like yourself, the counselors, the service providers, or do you want to build for the end consumer directly?
And frankly, it's something I ask myself, right? Do I want to... Because I had in this head that I want to work with everyone because, social programming here. And then I realized, no, I don't. I need to work with people who have these characteristics. And frankly, I do a lot of volunteering, but on average, who have the resources and are willing to spend them.
Makes
right?
sense, yeah.
I can't say like any random kid that's not going to work because I'm going to put them through hell and give them a lot of homework, and not everyone can do that. And I think some of the concerns you bring up are all of them are correct. Which ones matter depends on who you're going for, right? If you're going for a $50 billion company and that sells to hundreds of thousands, you've signed up for certain versions of hell. Whereas my bias is always toward low capital, high impact.
Yeah.
Because I never had the capital.
Yeah.
Still don't have it. Right. So that's how I've developed what I've done. Going slowly, but going so much that... Because there's a way I could have crashed, right? Spend $10,000 and hire a bunch of employees that I don't know are really good, whatever, and that would have been bad, right? And there are people who do that model. So I think you have to figure out across the business line, where do you want to have your headaches? Is it lead generation? Is it selling? Which customers? What price points? Do you want to be more tech or not? I've kind of gone toward a less tech thing because I know from my time working as a VP at PIMCO, those vendor softwares, those are expensive as heck. So I would say for anyone listening to this, be very intentional. Like start slowly and be very intentional about your audience and whether or not that fits your risk profile,
100%.
How much money you have, and frankly, who you want to actually serve. Because sometimes the mass market model is not the right model. And what we're learning in admissions, and I'm learning it directly, is the more you kind of niche yourself and you're really good at something, kind of like trying to get into college, the more successful you can tend to be.
Nice. I like that. Sweet. Towards the end, I like asking just a couple of rapid fire questions.
Sure.
How do you run your business right now? What's your tech stack? If you want to just mention all the tools you're using.
It is so low tech, it's embarrassing. It is Calendly to set up the calendar invites, Google Calendar. And by the way, I make all my students. Fun thing, I make all my students. One thing that's, if you're doing this business, make sure your students know how to follow and write email because that can cause some real problems. So I have said to students when I'm frustrated with them, show them your email, like share screen. I need to see your Gmail. 600 emails. That's why you missed that essay deadline, right? So Google Calendar and Google Gmail and Google Drive. I use Drive. I'll have the student create a folder so we have one source of truth, PMP stuff, and Zoom.
Nice.
That's it. I mean, at some point I'll become an LLC and do social media. So probably next is some kind of social media management thing. Okay. But it's very low tech because again, I used to do vendor contracts. I know how big those numbers are, so I keep it very low. And I think if at some point I'm a big business, then that will be a different conversation.
Nice. What are 3 resources you recommend to someone listening?
For admissions?
If you want to stick to admissions just because that's been the topic, that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
And resources can be book, online, podcast, whatever you are.
Yeah, I'll refer to some people. Yeah, I have some wild answers. I'm not going to refer to my own stuff in this question. I suggest people talk. There's certain people who do related parts that I think are awesome. There's one group called LSAT Demon.
Okay.
And they're in the law school side of things, but they tell the real truth. Like, they're like, do not do this. This is what scholarships are. Like, that Super Tutor, she does some great work. Those are the two that come to mind. I would say any of the major books on admissions, like published books, those tend to be pretty good. One of the ones that like started my business idea was a book called Admissions Confidential. By Rachel Tour. That was, you asked me about what was the aha moment. That was like, that really threw it in because this book's talking about how people in the admissions community behave, not about all the nonsense people tell you that college is about. That book I actually assigned it as reading.
Nice.
One more, anything by Cal Newport.
Okay.
I love his, the whole passion rant. He was the first one to start that. And I thought, I'm like, the guy is like an academic superstar. Like, he's written multiple books on this. He's a genius. I need to reach out to him. I think his understanding of how to do work and how to be efficient at doing work and how to remove all the noise is invaluable.
Nice. I like that.
Yeah.
I do this bit where I'll ask you a question from a previous guest, and I'll ask you to give me one for my next guest.
Okay.
So, question for you. What do you think is missing from the Austin startup ecosystem?
Ooh, that's a good question. And I say this, that's a great question. It's unclear where it is and how to find it. Because if, let's say I wanted to get a job at a startup, I have no idea. Even I, who spent all my time Googling and being like internet searcher, I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah.
Right. So like, that's probably the biggest thing, is visibility. Visibility, and for people to know how to enter that startup space, even casually, I would say that's the question.
I agree. Very valid point.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of disparate resources. There's a lot of like disjointed. There's like small hubs, but you got to know about them.
Yes.
Like, what Capital Factory is in Austin. I feel like it's a no-brainer if you've been here for a while. But so many, like I've met CEOs who are doing, a couple million a year. They're like, hey, where do I find these events? I'm like, just start a Capital. What's Capital Factory? I'm like, the fact that itself is not a very well-known thing, I think adds to your point of just, it's a very disjointed ecosystem. Yeah. I think a couple of players are trying to like bring it together, but like, I think there's a lot of like bureaucracy that comes. But anyways, who am I to comment on that? But
no worries.
Sweet. No, I like that. I like that answer. What's your question for my next guest?
And
it can be anything. Like,
it can be anything?
Like,
I would say, what keeps you up at night?
Sweet. But I think that's all I had for you. Okay. I think it was a great, I didn't even realize we're an hour 5. But thank you for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciated it. Where can folks reach out? What do you want to plug? Yeah. If you have something for anyone listening and offer anything, feel free to plug it in. We'll link everything.
Yes, so Anthony at elitecollegehacker.com. And I have a website, www.elitecollegehacker.com. You'll post the YouTube, Instagram.
Yeah, everything. Yeah.
The offers, I would say, I work all year round. So
okay.
I work with folks. If you're 2 years out, that's not too early. So if anyone, so I work with folks who are, who are high schoolers as early as 9th grade. I don't work below that because I think it's kind of weird to work with middle schoolers about that stuff. If someone's doing applications now, that's fine. And I've done medical school, business school, law school, PhD, master's, STEM, all of it.
Nice.
So anyone, and also people in college who are like, who need guidance on like how to make those decisions. That's a service I'm starting to do now. Because I think another opportunity, right, is that we have all these college students and no one's really telling them how to do well. So like, and in a weird way, your last question was the perfect point, because I was thinking, what you were saying about the startup scene is how every part of the education system is.
Yeah.
You would think, go talk to your professor in office hours, but no one tells you what office hours are.
Yeah.
Right? You would think, hey, they asked a specific question, answer that question as opposed to you get an F. But no one tells students that, so they get slaughtered.
Yeah.
Right? So that's, I'm trying to fix those problems. So
nice.
Those are, that's what I do. So if anyone wants someone to be a guide or help them, they should reach out.
And we'll link everything and we'll do that. But I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you.